And you're trying to give the young people something that will help them. Yet you don't know exactly what it ought to be.
Welcome back to the TeachThought podcast. My name is Drew Perkins. I am the Director of TeachThought Professional Development. And a couple notes before we get into our podcast today. As of today's publishing date, which is June 23rd, 2019, we are in late registration for TeachThought PBL Grow 19, our third annual summer learning conference here in Louisville, Kentucky. The dates are July 16th through 19th. If you're not aware of those dates and the details, you can go to wegrowteachers.com/grow19, or if you just go to either teachthought.com, our main website, or the wegrowteachers.com, our professional development site, you'll find links along the top for the conference, which gives you the details, the registration, and all of those things. Also, a quick reminder that we always appreciate if folks share and mention us in their social media, as well as review us on iTunes. That helps us sort of move up in the rankings and get more people to listen, which helps us to get better guests and more guests. So hopefully you find the podcast helpful, and if you do, please share it with folks who also might find it helpful. In this podcast episode, I spoke with Susan Kaiser Greenland, who is a repeat guest. She was on the podcast episode 65 back in February of 2017. I always enjoy talking with Susan because of her thinking and work around the mindfulness and meditation that I think is important as well. So she's got a new audio program called Mindful Parent, Mindful Child that we touched on very, very late in the conversation. Talked about some of the differences between mindfulness and awareness and meditation, and some of the cultural chasms that might be difficult to navigate and how important that might be, as well as touching on social justice and bullying and security and insecurity, as well as lots of the pieces around how mindfulness and meditation might be helpful for our schools and our kids as learners and just as human beings. So hope you enjoy the podcast. I enjoyed the conversation, and without further ado, here's Susan Kaiser Greenland. Susan, welcome back to the podcast. It's been a while. It's been since episode 65, and I think we're up maybe 100 episodes since then, so February 2017. So we talked then, and I don't think I've shared this with you, but it is actually one of our most popular episodes, most listened to episodes. I don't know if that equates to popularism, but so yeah, I want to give you an opportunity to, I guess, reintroduce yourself and tell our listeners kind of what you've been doing maybe since then, if you can remember. I know we had talked about your Mindful Games book, which was new at that time and still seems new, but yeah, tell us a little bit more about what you've been doing since then.
Well, thanks, Drew. It's good to be back, and it's good to talk to you. And congratulations on the podcast. That's a lot of podcasts you've done now, and I know that they provide a big service. I get a kick out of you saying it's one of the most listened to because it reminds me of a story. I remember when I first started going into schools to give parent talks, or talks before they started bringing mindfulness and mindful awareness programs into a particular school. And I remember being so flattered at the beginning because the turnout for the introductory parent talk was huge, and the administrators would say, hey, we don't know if this is the song or the singer, but the turnout for these talks is much higher than anything else that we get for our parent talks. And so when I was first starting out, I thought, wow, that's really nice. That's kind of great about the interest in mindfulness, and kind of flattering, until I realized that for parent talks in school, when the turnout is that high for a new program, it's usually because people are worried, What's up, man? We got to come and see and kind of protect our kids. And then I just had to laugh about it. So now when I see a high turnout at a parent talk, I think, okay, so people are a little worried here. So I approach it in that way. But yeah, thanks. I'm glad it's going well.
That's funny. I think I may have shared in the first podcast that when I taught psychology, one of the things that I did as part of, and just a very small part when we did sensation and perception, I did a guided meditation, certainly nothing like what you're doing, or at least not as sophisticated and as well done. It was a very simple script, but that being said, the kids seemed to really love it, and I was often surprised that I didn't get more parent pushback, especially in a fairly religious community, which might be perceived as a threat to some. And I always made the disclaimer, look, if you don't feel comfortable with this, feel free to opt out. But that was something people would say. Were taking my psychology class. They would say, oh, I heard you meditate in here. When are we going to meditate? So it's funny.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. It makes sense you didn't get pushback, because what I hear when I hear that, and that's now after being in this field for over 20 years and having not only done a lot myself, but done a lot of kind of mentoring and talking to teachers and supporting them, is they trusted you. And that's the key, I think, not just with teaching mindfulness, but teaching almost anything, is to develop that relationship first and that level of trust. And once that level of trust is there, then people can relax and start experimenting with new things or different approaches or different ways of learning and teaching. But very hard to do without having first established trust, which is another reason why it's so very important, especially as these mindfulness programs are getting rolled out all over the place, that they are not outside programs being slapped onto a school or onto a curriculum that everybody just kind of has to do, but that they are developed from the inside out by developing teacher competency and comfort level in an opt-in way. And then those teachers, where the trust is already established between teachers and students and the parent community and administration, can then, once they're well trained, start to bring this into their own classroom. That's how it becomes really integral to the fabric, integrated in the fabric of the school, as opposed to just another add-on, something else teachers have to do in a busy day.
Right, which is what happens with lots of professional development and whatever you might want to label mindfulness. It certainly can be professional development. It probably doesn't fit into lots of the typical professional development workshops that teachers attend. But again, that sentiment of, oh, here's another thing we have to do. Do we really understand it? Is it really worth doing? All those kinds of things, which brings me to my big wonder here is when you think about schools embedding mindfulness meditative practices, what are the questions that, or at least some of the big questions that you would think that they should be considering and asking in doing so?
Well, I think that raises a couple of different issues, or points to a couple of different issues. But the first is the authenticity and the experience level and the credentials, for lack of a better word, of the program provider or the program consultant. And the second is the development of a program that is an integration into what's already there, as opposed to an add-on, just as we were talking about, something else that people need to add to their busy day. We know, anyone who's worked in schools knows that there's all sorts of professional development programs, and districts will pay a ton of money to bring in a professional development program that's going to be life-changing, and well-established teachers are always rolling their eyes because they don't get the support they need over an extended period of time to really make that program work. So it's the flavor of the month this year, but a short period of time, there's another flavor of the month. So those are the two things, and they are both problematic if you want a quick fix, because my experience with mindfulness programs that really take hold and that address some of the things that you and I were talking about just a little bit before the podcast, things like the social justice issues and emotional literacy, those are going to take a while to integrate and develop and modify in a way that's appropriate for the culture of each individual school. So when I'm talking to decision makers, I encourage them to consider, even before the first mindfulness introduction to staff or parents, to think of this as a 3-year arc. Because unless if you're willing to give this about 3 years to figure out, to get your competency created within your school culture, to get some buy-in there, and to be able to modify established themes and principles so that they apply to your particular community and are told in the voice of your community. Absent that, you get a mindfulness program that can be fantastic for a while, that's usually spearheaded by one or two very enthusiastic and well-intentioned and sometimes trained individuals. But when those people leave, there's nothing left because because the program was really the pet project of these people. Mm-hmm. So it's a little bit longer haul, but looking at it in the long view and the idea of to really do service to your school community, to your students, to your teachers, to your parent community, to your staff, you really need to understand what this is all about and create a culture of mindfulness that's supported within the structures that are already there, as opposed to an add-on.
We certainly see that in all kinds of professional development settings, as you mentioned, sort of the latest thing, the latest flavor, and recommend that anything substantial is looked at as a process and as an arc, and starting small and growing. When you mentioned some of the sort of context-dependent or place-dependent, whether it's maybe a community, things that implementation practices or wrinkles that might be reflective of that particular community, what kinds of things might that be?
Well, I think that, my best story about this is one that I probably told on your last podcast, but it's a good story, so I'll tell it again, which is I had helped out in the development of some kids programs in Mexico with a wonderful organization that's there now, Atentamente. And I think I've gone there now 4 times over the past 7 or 8 years, and the organization is now enormous. But the first couple of years I went down and I taught them my games, and they basically delivered the games the way I had taught them. And then I remember getting a call from one of the people who was working with the kids program, who was working on developing kids practices, and she said, "Susan, we just have to add a little bit more salt and pepper to your games," And it's that kind of thing. The stuff that we were doing was here, and in the schools where I had been piloting them was just falling flat there. They needed to liven them up a little bit. And so I think that different, these types of activities, if you're in a religious school of any kind, you can modify these activities so that they're consistent with what you're already teaching. If you are in an inner city school, you're going to be teaching in a different way. Then you're going to want to modify the voice. You're going to want to modify the way that the games are facilitated. Then you might want to, in a different inner city school where the demographic is different, and certainly different than a school possibly in rural middle America. I mean, you modify the language, you modify the pacing, you modify the prompts, the questions that you're asking, so that the questions you're asking are really consistent with the people that are in the room right now. And it may sound like that's hard work, and it can be hard work, but it's also where the fun comes in. And it's also where you allow the creativity of the individual facilitators to really, get engaged, and you give them the license to really go with it. And when you get the facilitators, the teachers, or the parent facilitators interested, and give them the confidence and the tools that they need to start modifying these activities and developing new ones that are consistent with a set of principles, then it gets interesting all the way around. The facilitators don't get bored. They're engaged. They feel supported. And the kids, how many times can you ring a bell and have the kids raise their hand before they start rolling their eyes? So you have to keep modifying the games to keep the kids interested.
Mm-hmm. So then...
One last thing, I'm on a roll here, Drew.
Okay.
So the best games that have come out, the modifications of games that have come out, have been modifications that the kids come up with. And then they feel fantastic if you start having the kids lead the games and they come up with a good idea and then you integrate that. Then they feel heard, they feel seen, and they come up with material that then you can keep, funneling into the program.
So I want to place a marker and try to come back to some of those cultural pieces, because I think there's some interesting questions to be asked there. But before we do, I want to stay a little bit more wide with the scope here in just clarifying. And we probably talked about this in our first conversation, but just for folks listening, if you're a school, let's say administrator, leader, somebody who's interested in this, like what's the why for why we might implement more mindfulness meditative practices in our schools?
The why is because the fundamental principle of a classically developed mindfulness program is awareness. And awareness is absolutely everything. Awareness is necessary for everything from self-regulation, for development of executive function, to social and emotional skills, to academic skills, and to understanding and becoming aware of bias or unconscious bias or inequities. So awareness is key. And awareness in and of itself will not necessarily change anything. But one thing that one of my early teachers taught me that I have seen true time and time again is that once you're aware of something, it doesn't necessarily go away. It doesn't necessarily change, but your relationship to it changes. And when your relationship to it changes, then you can start making choices that are in the best interest of yourself and of those around you. So the development of awareness is key to everything from learning to social emotional skills to self-regulation to getting along better with the people around us and better understanding. So that would be my primary answer. And then there's a two-step process. The first I like to call mindfulness first, which is the development of an awareness and some very simple education on how the nervous system works. And I have been surprised by going into schools and mental health clinics, teachers and clinicians who are trained who don't have good language to explain to themselves, to their parents, to their coworkers and their kids basic nervous system function, and that when our nervous systems are overly heightened, when we're on high alert or even moderate alert, our bandwidth, our capacity to be able to think clearly, see clearly, listen, learn, regulate, be non-reactive, that necessarily narrows as a survival instinct. And with that bandwidth narrowed, we really aren't in a position to be able to solve problems or to take a test or to understand what somebody else is trying to say to us. So that's where mindfulness self-regulation strategies come first, because then we recognize when our nervous system is overly charged or a little bit on high alert, well, more than we want it to be. We use some of these strategies to help us settle back down. And as that settles, then our bandwidth opens, and then we have a greater capacity to listen, to learn, to regulate, and to be non-reactive.
So the sort of balance between logical and emotional seems to be one of the main things here. Sort of how do we help sort of block out some of the noise so that we can make better decisions and be a little bit more logical? Would that make sense?
Yeah, I think, from a mindfulness or an awareness standpoint, I think as a practical matter, you're right on. As just a language note, and where some of people get hooked up on mindfulness when they start facilitating, blocking out is not something we try to do. What we try to do is learn and develop the capacity to include and not get overly concerned or concerned at all, frankly, overly concerned about all of this noise that's happening. So we're not blocking it out, but we develop the capacity to focus on what matters most. Now, this is where it's really important to make a distinction between these practices for adults and for children, because young children don't have the developmental capacity yet to be able to include the various things that are going on in their head but not pay attention to them. They do need to move their attention to one thing and focus on one thing exclusively and exclude the rest. But as we get older, we do have the capacity to be able to hold different and competing ideas in our mind at the same time without reacting to them.
Yeah, I think you make a good point there, and blocking out is, I certainly, that I didn't mean it that way, and that's an important distinction. And I guess leads me to the question that I was going to ask after that, which is the sort of how do we, when you're trying to balance that. So, for example, I think, and I could very well be wrong about this, but I think that I'm fairly mindful, and people would probably describe me as not being really emotional. So I don't have really, you don't see me experience really high highs or really low lows. I'm really always trying to experience the emotions, recognize the emotions, enjoy the emotions, sometimes even the bad ones, but not necessarily be so reactive, and especially with kids when we're talking about reactive behaviors that can be really problematic. But is there a danger in sort of being, I don't know if this even makes sense, but being too mindful, where people, I mean, I have a friend who she says, you're like a cyborg sometimes, like it's like you're not experiencing emotions. And in reality, I'm experiencing those emotions. I'm just not outwardly expressing them maybe the same way that others might be expressing them. And I think some of that is mindfulness. Does any of that make sense?
Yeah, no, it makes total sense. And I think what you're pointing to here, one of the things you're pointing to is that with the popularization, and I don't mean that in this context as a bad thing. Sometimes you'll hear me talk about the popularization of mindfulness as a derogatory thing, but I'm not referring to it in that way here. What's happened is the word mindfulness has taken on many, many different meanings. And as a result, sometimes what you're talking about would be referred to as mindfulness. I wouldn't call that mindfulness. Mindfulness is a stance of attention where you know where your mind is and your state of mind in real time. And that, from my experience with you in our conversations, and also from what you're saying now, that it appears to me that you have in spades. But that awareness of where your mind is and your state of mind in real time does not modulate. It doesn't make what your experience is less or more. It's an awareness of what it is. So no, I don't think mindfulness does dampen your emotions, but I do think that it is something that mindfulness is off. I don't think mindfulness necessarily dampens emotions, but I do think that mindfulness is often used as an antidote, or that awareness, actually more specifically, is often used as an antidote. And when we do develop a capacity to be able to rest in what's happening right now, sometimes there's a great relief and an ease that comes, and then we use that as an antidote to difficult experiences. And that's very, very common. It's something that it's actually funny you mention it, because I go on meditation retreats with a couple of different wonderful teachers, mostly the two that I go annually are in the Tibetan tradition. And just in the last retreat I was on just a couple of months ago, in a small group session, my teacher pointed out to me that basically that's what I was doing, that I was using that skill of awareness as a way of resting next to the emotion rather than in it, rather than fully experiencing the emotion, resting next to it. And that's okay. It's actually very useful for a lot of real life situations. But to transform the emotion, you need to kind of really get right in there with it. So I think what you're talking about is something very common. I think I wouldn't necessarily say it's bad, and I would say that sometimes it's very, very good. But I would say that it is part of the process, and that the next step is to be able to strong emotion does rise up in all of us, and to sometimes, when the time is right, to really allow ourselves to just fully experience that without reacting to it. And that takes training, that takes practice, and that takes the development of a kind of mental muscle, or I would always say physical mental muscle, to be able to feel that stuff without losing awareness of it, because it's just so strong.
Well, so you're not giving me any excuses here.
Sure, I have. Excuse is that we can't go through life, or some people can go through life, but for those of us living workaday lives with mortgages to pay and deadlines to meet, and I know you were driving someone to Nutcracker practice last night in June, for goodness sake. When you're living that life, we can't always just drop everything to have this, when we feel strong emotions coming up, to get inside and really have the experience. We need to make it work, and this is one way that we can make it work.
Yeah. So coming back to the sort of marker that I put down, talking about some of the cultural pieces, are there, I guess, when you think about working with different cultures and different subsets of our population, I would imagine that there are certainly some of the things that you mentioned that would be helpful in better connecting. But are there certain cultures that you find are maybe further away from a mindfulness kind of practice and being accepting of that? I mean, I would think that there are, and sort of, not to put too fine a point on it, the idea of being mindful and doing meditation, I'm sure you've at least been jokingly criticized of being, that this is sort of nerdy or NPR-ish and weird or something like that. So
don't get New Agey California kind of thing.
Right. And there's a real danger in that New Agey stuff that gets away from the heart of mindfulness and meditation. But yeah, culturally, how do you navigate any of those sort of chasms between what is culturally normal and okay, or let's say cool, versus maybe a little bit more accepted?
Yeah, well, I think that's again where the mindfulness first piece, the idea of mindful or awareness based strategies to help you be aware of how your nervous system is responding right now, and to be able to reverse what Daniel Goleman coined probably 25 years ago, emotional hijack, through these types of awareness-based strategies. That is something that is very widely accepted and very widely welcomed in the West, and that's something that schools are more and more interested in, and that's something that I think is terrific. And you'll find lots of apps and lots of everything dealing with mindfulness-based, or what I would call awareness-based calming strategies to help you when, kind of deal with conflict, deal with strong emotions, and without ignoring them, and also to help with sleep. I mean, these types of the apps that really help with sleep are huge, because sleep is a problem, that, we all need sleep. I mean, I don't know if you've been reading this great work that's coming out about circadian code and the circadian rhythm that teaches us more and more the importance of sleep in absolutely everything, from how our systems regenerate to how we learn to how we think. So anything that is giving us that kind of very specific goal-oriented end result, I don't think in the West here in America or in Germany or in other countries that are kind of wired like we are, I don't think we're getting too much of a pushback in that it may need to be called something other than mindfulness. However, where there is the cultural difference and is when, for me, that mindfulness first piece, the nervous system piece, is key, but where it really gets interesting and where you can see actual transformation of society and systems and individuals is when you move beyond that into this idea of a series of universal themes that allow you to, or encourage you to, see life a little bit differently. And how you see life differently is you see it less metric-oriented, less left brain, less linear. And that, there's a huge cultural difference. Here, we're pretty left brain, linear, metric-oriented. But back in the East, those classical philosophies weren't as hierarchical, and the upside and the downside of every experience was viewed as a unity, as opposed to two sides of the spectrum, two poles on a spectrum here. And so that, I think, is where you see a big cultural difference, and where I personally think that we could learn a little bit by coming more to the middle.
So as you think about, and my guess is you've done this in a number of different settings, I'm just imagining how differently this might play out, and maybe even some of the differences perhaps in importance or what you might stress in the practice between, let's say, working with inner city kids who are really struggling with behavior and having really reactive episodes, those kinds of things, versus maybe even quite the opposite, very rural kids who might be reacting and thinking in a much, sort of their heuristic or the algorithms by which they go about life are perhaps a bit different.
Yeah, I mean, I think nervous system regulation is something we have to teach absolutely everybody across the board, because it's not just about our own nervous systems, it's about other people's nervous systems too. And I've said this a million times, but it's worth repeating. I have a 30-year marriage, and my eldest is now 28, and my youngest is 25. And if I had known just a little bit about the nervous system as a young wife and mother, I would have saved myself and everybody else a whole lot of trouble. Because what I used to do is that I didn't recognize that I was upset. Well, I did. I would recognize I was upset. I would recognize my kids were upset. I would recognize my husband was upset. And I would try to get in there and fix it while everybody was on high alert. And I didn't understand that none of us had the bandwidth at that point to reason this out or to think it through. And if I had just known to give everything a little bit more space, to encourage people to chill out a bit. I'm sorry, that's my phone.
That's okay.
And encourage people to chill out a little bit and let some time pass so that the nervous system piece of it could settle. Then there would be plenty of time to go back and try to sort out what needed to be done. And that is what I think is important for absolutely everybody, even people who aren't very reactive and are pretty good at their own self-regulation, learning to recognize in other people that that's what's going on and not be judging it. So think about this in a school context. There's the fight or flight response, and there's the freeze response. And from the perspective of mindfulness and awareness in connection with nervous system regulation, they're both very, very, they're both the same. It's just how you deal with each of them is a little bit differently. But both of them are the result of it just being too much. Somebody just being a little bit overwhelmed, just a little too much input. And as a result, you need a certain amount of input to be at the top of that arousal curve, a word I do not use when I'm working with teenagers, but that stress arousal curve. You need enough nervous system regulation to be alert and up at the top, but not so that you're open, receptive, ready to learn, but not so much that it tips you over. And when it tips you over, it tips some people over to one side, other people over to the other side. Sometimes people go to one side or the other depending on who they are. But we're used to the flight or fight part, where then people get more aggressive. And we recognize that, they're worked up. We're not as used to seeing that thing we see with so many kids with the arms crossed, the shoulders down, the kind of look on the face that is really a freeze reaction. And we often view that as defiant. So we respond to someone who we think is defiant in a very specific way, which is quite a bit different than how we respond to somebody who we think is overwhelmed. So if you think of being in a teenage classroom or in a teenage environment, and you see these people, and you see some people, with their arms crossed, looking what might appear to us as being defiant, and think, they're just a little overwhelmed. All of a sudden, that's a shift in how we are thinking about them. Compassion naturally emerges, and then we relate to them a little bit differently. And those are the kind of things that even if you're good at self-regulation yourself, starting to spot that in other people will modify your behavior toward them, will help compassion to emerge. And that's why it's important for absolutely everybody to learn this stuff.
Yeah, I would say that resonates with me hugely as I think about working with my own children. My youngest is much more like me personality-wise and has a great talent for pushing buttons and, really putting up a resistance that can elevate and escalate the conversation into argument really quickly. And as good at self-regulation as I think I might be, I still catch myself escalating. And sometimes escalation is okay and is necessary, but doing really, having that awareness of what am I experiencing, thinking, and feeling. Also, what might she be thinking and feeling, and how do we work through this in a way that's productive as opposed to destructive? And that's a really difficult thing to do because you get into managing those emotions, and those emotions are really good at pushing you to a place where you aren't making good decisions. You aren't saying things that you wish you would say or are happy you said later in life. So. One of the things I think probably is smart to do is, if you would, how do you define mindfulness? It's certainly different from meditation, and you've also talked about awareness. How are those three things defined and or different?
Yeah, that's a great question. And remember that everybody now, there's so many different definitions of mindfulness. What I encourage decision makers who are looking to bring a mindfulness program into a school or who are looking to take a mindfulness training course or who are just interested in a teacher, I think the first question to ask is, what do you mean when you're talking about mindfulness? What do you mean when you're talking about meditation? What do you mean when you're talking about awareness? And then also, be alert to whether or not how they're teaching this stuff is consistent with what their answer is. Because I would say that if the people who are teaching mindfulness in a particular program, if it doesn't feel like they are responding a little bit differently to the events around them, facilitating the classroom conversation or group conversation a little bit differently. If it doesn't feel like that there's a little bit difference in the way that they are navigating the world, then just hold that in mind and know that people who have extensive experience in this practice, and you do start to see shifts there that may be hard to pinpoint, but are easy to feel. So I think the first question to ask people is the one you just asked me. How are you using the word mindfulness, meditation, and awareness? And the word mindfulness, I use a definition that is basically comes from a classical perspective, which is mindfulness is a metacognitive awareness of knowing where your mind is and what your state of mind is, and what state of mind could be angry or agitated or distracted or down in the dumps or elated in real time, like right now, not knowing what your patterns are right now, not knowing what you're going to do in the future, but just in real time. Where's your mind, and what's the state of your mind right now in real time? That is mindfulness with a lowercase m. That's the definition of mindfulness. What's happened with the popularization of mindfulness is a definition is being developed in popular culture that I would call more mindfulness with a capital M. And that's more of a way of being in the world, and that includes any one of a number of things. I like to talk about it as navigating through life with attention, balance, and compassion. So that's mindfulness. Meditation is working with your mind directly, getting to know your mind, becoming friends with your mind, and understanding how it works. And mindfulness is a big part of that. But that's a slight distinction between those two things. And awareness is a third thing. Awareness is something that is always with us. Awareness is it's a steady, enduring presence of mind, for lack of a better word, that is quite expansive and that is just always there with clarity, and without a lot of emotion. So good way to think about awareness is to think about awareness as the sky. If you look in the sky, there's the sky, it's the blue sky. Sometimes we have a hard time getting to it because there's storm clouds in front of it. Those storm clouds can be thoughts, emotions, sensations, but always behind that, there is the sky. Or you can think of awareness as the ocean. There is an ocean. It's always there, but sometimes it's quite choppy because of the waves. So the awareness is to just remember that even if it's wavy, even if there's like a lot of strong waves in the ocean, or even if the sky is full of thunderclouds, awareness is like the sky or the ocean in that we can tap into it even beyond these strong emotions that I'm talking about as either clouds or waves. I probably would have been better off choosing one of those examples rather than two. I have a feeling that got a little confusing. But I hope you get the idea that if we just tap into the sky, which is always there, which is a big, spacious stance of awareness, that can give us some steadiness and some comfort and some ease, even when there's a lot of storm clouds.
So when you're working with teachers and schools and kids, would you say more of a focus would be on mindfulness and awareness than meditation per se?
Yeah, it also, remember, a lot of this depends on the age, because you have to think of what children are capable of understanding at a particular developmental period. And for young children, and moving up through the majority of elementary school, the primary focus is anchor practices, focusing on one thing and nothing else, and that would be mindfulness. And even then, your mindfulness researchers would tell you that's not mindfulness, because mindfulness has a metacognitive element, which means you have to know where your mind is. Which doesn't come on board early on too. But early on, kids can focus on one thing and ignore distractions. So that's just a little developmental, important but developmental cul-de-sac. But when you're talking about focusing on in school-based, yes, I would say mindfulness and awareness. And the reason why is because in a school-based program, especially in a group setting, we want to keep these practices brief and frequent. And we don't want long periods of introspective. Generally speaking, these are all general rules. There can be, things that change based on situation. But generally speaking, we want to avoid long periods of introspection because it's in the long periods of introspection that there's more potential for a trauma-related reaction or trauma trigger. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't be triggered, with trauma triggers with even a very brief period of awareness. But the danger is less with short periods of awareness frequently throughout the day.
Yeah, which is leading me to one of the questions that I think is important to really consider and think about is how you deal with that. So there is the danger of these kinds of practices and work insofar as that there are folks who might have an adverse reaction as adults, and especially, as you noted, kids. And if we're talking about schools, that there's a liability issue, there's some real concerns, there's some certain things that parents might be pushing back on. And it's important to recognize that the research behind meditation and mindfulness is so early in its I guess lifespan, if you want to use that word. But there's so much we don't know. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't try and work through some of these things, but proceed with caution.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think it's important to remember that much of the work that is coming out now on serious trauma reactions happen on long retreats, long meditation retreats, not in these short periods of mindfulness throughout the day. So I think that it's good to be aware of it. It's good not to shy away from that conversation, but it's good also to recognize that, dropping into a brief practice for 30 seconds of calming is not going to trigger the same kind of reaction as sitting on a silent retreat as an adult for a week, 2 weeks, a month, 2 months. So just with that kind of contextualizing, I think that the worry about emotions coming up in short periods of practice throughout the day in a school can be completely and entirely taken care of by training facilitators well. And there are just a few simple, basic, commonsensical, but important kind of best practices for people to use to help people recognize when strong feelings are coming up and to learn how to manage them and to facilitate them. So, if a strong feeling comes up in a classroom, great. It's good for the child to feel the feeling, but we need to know how to manage it. And how we manage it is we acknowledge the feeling, we contain it. We do not get in a long conversation in a group of 20 children about somebody's tears while they were practicing because their guinea pig died earlier, or something far, far worse, which has happened, both have happened to me in classrooms where there's been, violence in the home or that sort of thing. We acknowledge the feeling. We ask other people in the classroom how many other people have had, and we say the feeling in a very general way. How many other people have had really horrible things that happen at home that have been scary? Most kids will raise their hand, and then we contain it. But we circle back. we circle back to the child afterwards outside of the group situation, talk about what happened, and if necessary, and if it feels appropriate, refer that child to whatever the appropriate referral source would be in the school, whether it's a school counselor or something like that. So I think it's important to remember that these things, by keeping your eyes open when you're reading a meditation in a classroom, by cutting it short, if you can see somebody starting to have a difficult time during the meditation, whether it's tears or whether it's an amount of physical restlessness that seems a little bit more than the normal physical restlessness somebody has. And then you don't say, oh, we're going to stop meditating now because Johnny is crying, but you just close the meditation. You always check in. How was that for you? So people will tell you, often the children who look to you like maybe that they were a little bit uncomfortable, don't speak up at that time, and then you circle back. There's always time to go back and check in, say, hi, how was that going? Tell me about it. Normalize the experience. Listen, strong feelings happen to everybody, and then offer ideas for help or refer people who might be able to help if you're not in a position to do so.
Right, and I would say it would seem to me that there's a distinction in mindfulness and meditation in this context, that deep introspection, that self-examination, I would think would be much more likely to surface some of those real raw emotions and trauma kind of things, versus the mindfulness check-ins that are, I think, really helpful. I find them helpful. I try to catch myself and take a deep breath and really, listen to the birds for a few moments or something like that, which is not about emotions or self-examination so much as just sort of resetting. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. And all that said, it does happen that a child sits down and within 30 minutes is flooded with tears. I mean, I remember that happened to me really early on in maybe one of my first months of teaching at the Boys and Girls Club in Santa Monica. A little boy who was quite physically active, and had always been kind of running around, but he loved coming to this circle that we had in the corner of the art room. And I remember once he sat down, I rang the bell, and it wasn't more than a couple seconds before he was in tears. Because if you think about it, some of these kids have been on the go since very early in the morning, running around, and all of that is a way of, part of it is just real life, but part of it's avoiding feelings. So the moment they sit, the feelings come up. And you know what? That's completely and totally okay. Teachers are trained, whether they know anything about mindfulness or not, how to deal with that kind of thing. And it's wonderful that the child has a chance to feel a feeling, express a feeling, and be supported in it, and supported in these themes of mindfulness, that it's just a feeling. And it's like a visitor, and just like all visitors, it will come and it will go. And just like we are with all visitors, we're going to be polite to it and we're going to be kind to it, which means being kind to ourselves, not beating ourselves up because we're sad, not beating ourselves up because we're scared, but also contextualizing it that this is what it is right now. It's here, but like a visitor, it's going to pass. It will go. And then it might come back again. It may not be, some visitors are more welcome than others. That's just how it goes.
Right. And one of the things that I wonder is how you yourself and or suggest teachers or facilitators dealing with kids, let's say elementary, middle school, and I would imagine maybe even at the high school age, who really struggle or are going to push back because of what they perceive, how they perceive meditative mindfulness to be kind of, they might say, oh, this is stupid, this is no fun, this is boring, all of those things. And, with full disclosure, I certainly try to help my daughters be mindful and those kinds of things. But one of the things that I tried with them was, I think it was, you and I were talking about Sam Harris before we started recording, and of course he's big into meditation, a big name, and he has his Waking Up app, which I've used and enjoy. I think it was Annika, his wife, who recorded, she's created some for kids. And so I tried a couple of those with my daughters and was met with just almost visceral resistance, which in the long term, I think they reflected and now think that there's at least some takeaway there that was useful. But in the moment, it was certainly like, and we don't want to say sit down and breathe and pay attention to your breathing, and you have to do like that. That's counterproductive. But how do you work through those instances with kids?
Yeah, well, I think that's why, first of all, just to respond with an example. I mean, my kids, I got nothing but eye rolls from them. Nothing.
Well, that's comforting.
Yeah, and so I stopped using. Because my husband and I, it was very important to us that our program for the kids. I started this, for people who don't know, I started this work for my kids because I was a meditation practitioner and I thought it helped me, so it helped them too. And at that time, which was back like 1998 or something, maybe a little earlier than that, there were no secular programs. There were only programs in Buddhist centers and a family retreat. So we went to the Zen Center because we thought we would give it a try. And our son, we sat down to practice, and it was a few minutes or a few seconds. It was not long before my son turned to my husband and said, "How long do I have to still stay here, pretend somebody stole my brain?" So my husband said, "Okay, we're done." And so we got up and we left, at which point my daughter got something caught in her throat. And they were like, I think my son was in preschool or kindergarten or something, and my daughter a couple years older. And my daughter got something caught in her throat, and she had to spit it out. She got all upset because she had hawked in the holy plants, and it was just, it was not a good fit for us. So anyway, I started developing these things in a secular way, hoping that I could just adapt the stuff that I had done with my own practice for them. But the kids rolled their eyes. They didn't like it. So I stopped using the word mindfulness. And then in 2010, when my son was probably in middle school or high school, I don't remember which, the book came out and the teachers knew me and one of his teachers had read the book and said to Gabe, "Hey, did you practice mindfulness growing up at home? Or I hear you did that." And he said, "No, we never did any of this." And the teacher, because she had known us, said, "Well, did you?" And she started listing the kinds of things. Did you stop by the door before leaving in the morning and take 3 deep breaths? Did you do this? Did you do that? And he said, yeah, we did all that. And he came home and he said, "Mom, I never knew that was mindfulness. I had no idea," because I stopped saying the word mindfulness and just started dropping the activities. So as parents, we've got to remember the eye rolling is very normal. All that said, every child has a different pathway in at a different time, at a different age. And so sitting still may be good for one child, visualization may be good for another, movement might be good for somebody else. So we just try a whole bunch of different things, but we don't ever force it. If they really are resistant, we let it go. We might try to sneak it in and do stealth mindfulness in different ways and not let them know that it's mindfulness. And sometimes the kids learn better from teachers other than their parents. So it doesn't surprise me at all that there was some resistance to, some meditations on an app. And but one of the great things about kids' apps that is not talked about a lot is that if parents just listen to a couple of good apps with kids' meditations on them, then they get a sense of how to do this themselves. And then they can let the app go, and they can lead something like what they heard on the app in their own voice with their child, and then that takes that in-between thing out of it.
Right. So the value in doing some of these things. We were talking about some of the social emotional learning and social justice connections. How do you see? Certainly, social emotional is a good fit. I don't think that's a hard connection to make. But where do you see the connections to social justice in a productive way?
Well, I think that we go back to awareness. And when the combination of nervous system, awareness of our nervous system and strategies, using awareness and mindfulness to help us, self-regulate, and awareness of getting to know our minds better and understanding, becoming aware of different patterns of thought, minds, reaction, that sort of thing. And again, as I said, once we're aware of these patterns, they won't necessarily go away, but our relationship to them changes. So every time they show up, something softens, something shifts. Robert Wright, who wrote a great book with a lousy title, Why Buddhism is True. And the reason I say that's a lousy title is that if it didn't have the word Buddhism in it, I think it's a widely read book already, but I think it'd be an even more widely read book. And I don't think it needs to be related to Buddhism per se, although what he's talking about, the roots are from Buddhism. He has created something called Mindful Resistance, which is a pretty great newsletter, if you haven't subscribed to it yet, that talks about the different ways that just awareness in and of itself can help us in the social justice movement. So I think it's the awareness piece of it and what we call the view or the worldview piece of it, where we start to see just all of the countless elements, bits of field of causes and conditions that lead up to absolutely every moment, and how little control we actually have that allows us to accept in a way what's going on, but at the same time act with wisdom and compassion, knowing that we do the best we can, we make our best shot, but then we just have to let the phenomena play out. And this type of thinking, this type of view, which we teach kids from very early on, perspective taking, by showing them a picture that is either a duck, that looks like either a duck or rabbit, and say, is it a duck, is it a rabbit? And kids usually have a first impression, it's one or the other, look at it harder, see that it could also be both duck and rabbit. And then we say, so if you thought it was a duck, were you right or wrong? If you thought it was a rabbit, were you right or wrong? Can one thing be two things at the same time? These types of things allow us to broaden our perspective. The same with a 6 or a 9. You show the 6 or the 9, and you say, if you're looking at it from this direction, what's it look like? It looks like a 9. If you're looking at it from this direction, what does it look like? It looks like a 6. Is one person right or one person wrong? Or is it possible that what we see depends to a certain extent on our perspective, on the way in which we're looking? Another one of those is that great, the elephant and, the blind people touching the elephant. And if you only touch the leg and you can't see the whole thing, you think it's a tree trunk. If you touch the tusk and you can't see the whole thing, but you feel the sharp tusk, you think it's a knife. And again, are these people right? Well, they're right about what they're feeling. Are they right about the whole, what they're able to see or experience, but can they see the whole picture? No. So those kind of games help us tell kids at a very young age that to develop a better understanding of perspective taking and a better comfort level with we don't know. So some of the things we don't know are what we are projecting onto situations, how just because we feel one thing about something, other people may not feel the same thing. And it opens up some space for conversation and for some learning. So those are the types of things, those awareness-based activities based on these universal themes that come from all sorts of traditions, from philosophy, from psychology, from contemplative training. Those are the things that can really help us develop a broader more holistic view and help us with this type of social justice work.
So it feels like that is consistent with the theory that, and I'm going to be talking with Jonathan Haidt here later in the summer, but one of the things he points out he and Greg Lukianoff in Coddling of the American Mind is Martin Luther King Jr.'s principle of sort of drawing bigger circles instead of drawing smaller circles and becoming more identity politics based, versus how can we draw a bigger circle and say we're all sort of under the same tent while we have differences, but that understanding that there are those differences instead of maybe I'm not saying this right, but that we focus on those differences, but we're aware of those differences and the similarities, not just the differences perhaps. And it seems to me that it also might be really helpful in helping kids navigate that outrage, the offense kind of culture that we have, that seems to have developed now, that words are violence, and that much of what people might do might be perceived as a threat and as an attack, as opposed to being a little more mindful about it. And by no means am I saying people should be mindful, meditative, and be subjects to abuse, but also it's important to recognize and realize and think through what am I feeling? What's the intent here of the person that might have said or done something, and how can we work through that situation in a way that I can be really clear and true about what is happening versus just reacting to that emotion, and it seems like that would make a big difference.
Huge difference. And again, that's where these principles of better understanding, the better awareness of the nature of emotions come into play. I mean, one of my teachers talks about these emotions. It feels real, but just because that emotion feels real doesn't necessarily mean it's true. Mm-hmm. So those types of that awareness, and again, being able to put some space around those emotions and understand, yeah, this feels real, not denying that it's happening, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's true. That person may not have actually just insulted me. That person may not actually dislike me, hate me, think less of me, whatever. Or, that kind of expansiveness and space around the thoughts and emotions that come up is helpful. It also doesn't deny the fact that that some of these things may be true. So, yeah, this is where these fields go together beautifully.
Is there any connection to, and I think that there's some, again, the idea that you might take something as offense, there's a little bit of connection here to bullying. I just released a podcast where we're talking about bullying and anti-bullying, and Izzy Coleman was my guest, and he was really emphasizing his method and his suggestion for kids to react to bullies that might say, hey, they might be making fun of you for being fat or tall or skinny or whatever it is. And so his reaction or suggestion was to sort of react as though that didn't bother you and say, yeah, I'm fat. I wish I were skinny like you. And that seems to me, one of the questions I asked him seems like that's a really hard ask of kids. But it seems like it would be easier to be able to do that if you were a bit more mindful and slower in your thinking as opposed to reactive. Is there any connection or any work that you've done with bullying?
Yes, but and I think the example you're giving is a good one, and I'd just like to offer a possible different take on how to respond to that. First of all, what we're asking somebody to say, yeah, I'm fat, is a big ask. Because or I'm fill in the blank. Or yeah, I'm not very smart. I'm not as smart as you, or this, that, or the other thing. That's a big ask. It takes a long time and a lot of personal development for us to be comfortable with things. And so maybe somebody is comfortable saying that, but it's a big ask. But the other thing that I noticed in that is, and I wish I was skinny like you. Really? I mean, I get why that might defang the bully, but no, I mean, we need to be comfortable with who we are, and then have goals for how we want to change. So if somebody says, "Hey, you're fat," if you want to have it something like an acknowledgement to the bully to defang it. This is how I am. I'm sorry if it bothers you. But this is who I am. And then just try to walk away. But what's fat to one person isn't fat to another, and I don't know. It's just that whole thing of idealizing anything, whether it's skinniness, whether it's prettiness, whether it's being cool, whether it's being smart. There's so much more to all of us other than our physical appearance or our grades in school or our popularity. And again, if we bring it into the context of change, everything changes. And, I have known many, many people who are carrying a few extra pounds, especially when they're young, who as their bodies change, they don't even need to do much about it, but as their bodies change, things change, and they end up finding the ideal fit weight for them. My question would be on this issue of body type is fitness, Hey, you're fat, well, the goal isn't fat or thin or skinny. The goal is to be fit and healthy. So that's kind of my general reaction to that.
Yeah, the piece
work. I'd be interested. You said Izzy Coleman, was that it?
Yeah. It was one of the more, I think, maybe my two podcasts ago. But yeah, and that was a question that I had that I like you said, sort of defanging, and whether it's true or not, whether I want to be skinny like you, or like one of my daughters thinks she's and she is a little shorter than many of her peers, although several of her peers are taller than average, so she de facto is going to be shorter than they are. But she said sometimes they make fun of her for being short, and I said, well, try this next time. I said, say, yeah, I wish I was tall like you, or taller like you, and I can identify with being short, because I didn't break 5 feet until I was a junior in high school. So you can imagine how that is certainly a real thing, and I certainly did wish I was taller. Wasn't anything I could do about it. So one of the things that I asked about, and I think is interesting, and I wonder how mindfulness meditation might help with this sort of being more secure with yourself and insecurity, because if you're insecure about being fat, tall, whatever you might be insecure about, that's where that hard ask is that's the scab that people might go after, and that's such a hard thing to be able to say, yeah, I wish I was taller, but only can you do that if you are, I think, secure in yourself. And to me, being introspective and really slowing down and accepting what is what, whether it's good or bad, not necessarily putting a value judgment on it, is a part of that.
Well, I think this is where, and again, we talked about this combination, the 1-2 punch, mindfulness first or awareness first as a nervous system self-regulation strategy. And then we're open to this absolutely limitless, interesting, and engaging world of view, how we view things. And let's go back to the example on tall, because that's a little bit less charged than fat.
Sure.
And what I would encourage your daughter to say is, yeah, sometimes I wish I was tall like you. I can see how that could be helpful, but sometimes it's really helpful to be my size. So what that does is that broadens the view. And we use that with things like emotions, and we use that with appreciation practices, in that we acknowledge the difficulty. So for example, right now I'm upset about something. So we acknowledge I'm not personally upset right now, but let's say
that's good to hear. I was worried there for a moment.
No. So let's say a child is upset about something. So we acknowledge the upset, and then we expand it. So say, okay, I feel it. That's really tough, buddy. Can you also think of 3 good things? So that way we help kids understand that even when there's difficulties, there's also good things. So I would encourage your child who is a little bit shorter to acknowledge that maybe sometimes it'd be nice to be a little bit taller, especially if she likes to play basketball, that kind of stuff. But there's also some good things about what she is absolutely right now, so that broadens the view. It doesn't deny the difficulty, but it also encourages thinking about other ways and getting us away from, and this is the aspect of view that I like so much about the classical mindfulness training, and what we talked about earlier in this podcast is that the Western notion, the American, for example, notion tends to be pretty binary. Tall is better, short is worse. The Eastern it's all kind of one and the same. It's less binary. So how we can use this view to help us in all aspects of daily life, start looking at things as not quite so black and white, not quite so binary. I think it's interesting, it's exciting, it never gets boring, and I think it helps the kids start to develop a broader view that, again, going back to your earlier talk about social justice, is very helpful in a social justice context.
Mm-hmm.
As well as just a regular building up self-esteem and self-confidence.
Yeah, it was interesting. One of the reactions that she had when we were talking about that, and I mentioned, try this, saying, yeah, I wish I was tall like you kind of thing, and see how that goes. Again, I think recognizing that that's maybe a quick fix way to sort of defang the enemy at the moment, especially with a real bully, not a friend who's sort of jokingly making fun of you. But she also did say, well, they're going to have, or we both kind of came to the conclusion that some of the taller girls are going to have problems when they get older because of societal norms and finding mates that usually girls want a man who's taller than they are, and some of those things which will become more important or less important, and so broadening that view I think has been really helpful. It was interesting that you said that, and reflecting back, and essentially that's one of those conclusions that we came to.
Yeah, no, it makes sense because it's there's plus and minuses to everything. It's great to be tall. I mean, I would love to look like a runway model. I think that would be absolutely fantastic. But I also really like the way I am. So it's and believe me, I don't look like a runway model. So it's all good. It's all good.
I remember just a side story that reminds me. I remember I got a job in a school, and there was an introduction kind of ceremony or activity. It was new teachers. It was 25 of us or so, a superintendent. And the superintendent asked everybody to go around the room and introduce yourself and then say, if you could be anybody, who would you want to be? And I just thought, I panicked almost at that moment, because I thought, well, why would I mean, I'm pretty happy with who I am, and why would I don't want to be anybody else. How can I answer this in a way that, because I think I even said, you can't be yourself, and thought, well, this is a bad sign for where this job is going.
Yeah. Believe me, yeah.
So, well, I'm aware and mindful of your time as we've, I think, surpassed an hour or so here. I know I want to give you an opportunity to tell us a little bit about your audio program, and of course you have the books, and make sure everybody knows the things that are out there. You have a newsletter and your social media and all those good things.
Oh, well, thank you. I did just come out with an audio program. It's 30 guided meditations for grown-ups. It is called Mindful Parent, Mindful Child, and it's focused on parents because the need is so great. I know that this podcast is mostly directed towards schools and administrators and teachers, But not only are teachers and administrators often parents, but as I'm sure those listening will agree that, so much of this comes from what's happening at home. So if we can get the entire system better understanding what we're talking about when we're talking about mindfulness and awareness, that would be great. So the program is called Mindful Parent, Mindful Child, but honestly, any grown-up could do it. And it follows this structure we've been talking about the whole podcast. It's mindfulness first, nervous system awareness and regulation, and then it goes into it. The idea is it's a short meditation you can do, guided practice you can do for 30 consecutive days, but you can jump around if you like and that sort of thing. And then it goes into the remainder have to do with this aspect of view, things like how everything changes, things like sometimes sometimes the harder we try, the less likely we're able to succeed. Things like appreciation that we've been talking about, things like this broader view. So that you can get on Audible through Amazon if you have the Audible, or you can download the Sounds True app and get it on Sounds True and then listen to it via an app. So either way works, and you can get to that through my website. It's a long name. It's Susan Kaiser Greenland.com. That's SUSAN Greenland like the country.com. And then you can find it there. And then I have a newsletter. You can sign up for a newsletter there. It comes out once or twice a month, and it tends to have in it different profiles of industry thought leaders and guided practices and videos. And then the books, there's The Mindful Child, which was my first book, and then more recently Mindful Games and a set of activity cards that goes with that.
Right. And social media?
I'm on everything, so you can find me on Twitter, SusanKGreenland.com, Facebook, Susan Kaiser Greenland, and Instagram, Susan Kaiser Greenland.
Okay, and we'll make sure to link to all those things in the show notes, so if folks are listening on iTunes, which is the most popular place, you'll have to go to one of the pages that we have on TeachThought.com or WeGrowTeachers.com. So we'll make sure to put those things there. And Susan, it's always great to talk with you and pick your brain about mindfulness and meditation and being aware and all those good things. So thanks for your time.
Thank you. Wonderful to talk to you, and keep up the good work.
Thank you. You too. That'll do it for today's podcast episode. Thanks again for tuning in. Don't forget to review us and share us on your network so we can grow our audience to better meet your needs. Also, don't forget to find us on our websites, TeachThought.com and WeGrowTeachers.com, as well as our various social media outlets.